Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. So, tier 4 today, finally managed to get everything else done in my life and get this one finished. Sorry it's taken a while, but still lots to get through today, so let's get into it. As always, I really hope you enjoy. So first off today, a very similar vehicle to one we covered previously, the T-34-85. A vehicle that's very similar to the 85D5T in tier 3, but with a handful of advantages. Armour for the most part is functionally the same. The armour around the mantlet itself has a slight redesign, but it functions in basically the same way. This version also gets some track armour on the sides of the hull and turret as an unlockable upgrade. Its survivability is increased in a different way though, as this version has an extra crew member in the turret, and this also shaves a second or so off the reload, making it 9.6 seconds stock, putting it on par with the Tigers, Panthers and Pershings. This version uses a slightly different 85mm cannon, but the performance is the same across the board. It does lose a few degrees of elevation, but that's never really going to come into play anyway. It does get the APCR round as well, but it has very limited functionality. You'll basically never use it. As for mobility, it's the same as the previous 85 as well. It's just a tiny bit slower when equipped with the extra tracks. So the playstyle of this tank doesn't really differ too much from the T-34 in the last episode. The only real active change is the reload buff, which is great, as it means as long as you have a good crew, you can trade shots with most of the common guns around this BR quite safely. And it was fair to say the reload of the D5T did hold that last version back, which means you can safely be a bit more aggressive with this thing. A new problem crops up with this tank though, as it's at a BR of 5.7. 6.7 games are still really common, and at that battle rating you'll start meeting tanks you'll really struggle against from the front. Centurions, the Tiger 2H, Jagdpanther, T-34 Heavy, etc. It's still possible to disable these vehicles from the front, but it certainly isn't easy to consistently do. The 85mm does really start to struggle up here, which means you either need to get on the flanks if you do find yourself at that battle rating, or construct a lineup with vehicles that work better in up tiers. A lot of tanks we'll cover later have cannons that work great even at the high BRs, so you won't need to force yourself to play the T-34 in those max up tier games if you're not quite as confident with the gun. If you haven't already, I'd recommend watching the previous videos as we go into a bit more detail with the T-34 playstyle there. I don't want to annoy people by going over the same tactics over and over. To sum it up in a sentence though, just keep angled and keep on the move you're about to be shot at, and you should still bounce some shots. All you really need to be wary of is rough terrain, as predictably the gun depression is still rubbish, and the BR you're playing at. At 6.7 you don't want to risk running head on into the enemy 6.7 tanks, so consider playing on the flanks and try and be a little bit more passive. You can't rely so much on your armour or gun frontally at this BR, so you'll have to make use of your mobility. Try and use it to snake your way into the map and try and get some shots on the heavies from the side, as that's easily where your gun will work the most consistently. Below 6.7 though, you can really do anything you like. This tank is hugely versatile. You can snipe, brawl and everything in between. Whatever your playstyle is, this tank will work. Pros: good firepower, good mobility, and versatile. And the cons: unreliable armour. And as quite literally, I would class every tank this tier as having poor gun depression, so I won't put it in the cons this time as it will just get annoying reading it out every time, so just imagine it's always there. Anyway, verdict: get it. It will start losing its effectiveness a little bit at the higher BRs, but it will always have the potential to work everywhere. It's a really versatile machine. It's a great backup late in the game or as a first spawn, and you can really just do what you like with it. Just be a little bit more careful than usual at the higher BRs and you will get the job done. Next up, a pretty drastic change in design, the T-44, which improves on the role the T-34's played in every single way. It's slightly faster and more responsive, not by much, but definitely enough to notice a difference. In terms of firepower, it uses the same 85mm gun, but comes with a few extra rounds. An improved APCR shot, which again doesn't really have much use, and an improved APHE round, which does offer some extra penetration, but loses half the filler. This round still performs well against angles, and gives the 85 the buff to penetration it needed to work at 6.3 and above. The capped A round still technically does work better against heavily sloped armour, but as this new round carries more penetration, they almost equal out. I personally do use this new round, the BR367. The lack of filler rarely comes into play, and I find it still works quite consistently against angles. Both this round and the A round will work just fine though. What makes the T-44 special though is the armour. This thing has brilliant protection. Unless you're at point blank range, practically all APHE rounds apart from the German 128 can't get through the front plate. The long 88, 90 etc, none of these guns can get through. The hull side is also 75mm thick, so you can safely angle a bit as well, though of course heat and sabot will still get through. The turret is also pretty well protected as well. Frontally it's 110mm thick, but as the edges are slightly rounded, the effective thickness is closer to around 140 plus. The mantlet itself is fairly flat though, although it does have a spall shield directly behind the mantlet which can catch some shots as well. One negative aspect of the armour that's worth noting though is the roof armour. It's only 15mm thick, so any aircraft equipped with cannons and heavy machine guns can rip through this thing from the top. So just be wary of any aircraft flying overhead, as even clean wing fighters can take you out. In any case though, the T-44 is probably one of my most favourite vehicles in the entire game. It really does have everything. Well, almost everything. Admittedly, the gun does start lacking a little bit on certain maps and in up tiers, and you are really going to struggle with Tiger 2Hs, Jagdpanthers, all the usual suspects really. But this time around, you do have the reliable armour and the mobility to get the tank where it needs to be in order to work effectively. This is a really good aggressive vehicle. Its reload is the same as a lot of common enemies around this BR, you have the armour to bait shots and brawl easily, and the mobility and fast turret traverse to let you react to enemies very quickly. You have all of the assets to safely play at close range where the gun works best. If you meet an enemy round a corner, for example, that you can't easily penetrate, what I try to do is bait a shot with the front plate, then try and disable their barrel and flank them. Thankfully, a lot of the armoured German tanks you might struggle with have quite large muzzle brakes, so knocking out the barrels on these tanks is actually quite easy. If you're out of cover and an enemy is lining up a shot on you, make sure to keep on the move and slightly wiggle your turret around too. And the flat parts will become quite hard to hit if the angle of the turret keeps changing, so you can definitely bounce some shots this way. It's not always going to save you, but it's really the best fallback you've got. This thing really can play anywhere and utilise any area of the map. At its battle rating, it can work on the front line safely enough, but in up tiers though, you might need to flank a bit as the gun will start to struggle in head-on fights with the late heavy tanks. So if you're playing it around 7.0, flanking around the edges of the map is a pretty good idea. In general though, this thing will just mould to your playstyle. As long as you avoid rough ground, you can play it in your favourite style and favourite spots on the map quite consistently. The gun might not be the most reliable, but overall it is a very forgiving tank. Pros: good mobility, great armour, and versatile. And the cons: suffers in up tiers. Verdict: definitely get this one. It's a really useful and versatile tank that can get a lot of jobs done on the battlefield. All you need to actively do is get it into a position where the gun performs well, and the tank will just do the rest. This might be one of the most reliable tanks in this tier. Next up, a direct upgrade, the T-44-100. This version comes with a slightly improved engine, a roof-mounted 50 cal, additional side armour protection, and of course a 100mm gun. Around this BR, the 100mm D10 cannon is quite common, which is a good thing as it is very powerful. It comes with 3 APHE rounds, standard stock, APHE-BC and APC-BC. This last round, the D, has very similar performance to the German long 88, having slightly less filler but with slightly better penetration performance, and it's the round I've certainly had the most consistency with. The downside though is the reload at a very slow 13.7 seconds stock, making it much higher than the average reload for this BR, which is really one of its only drawbacks. The mobility is good, the armour is good, though not quite as reliable as the previous T-44, as this version will see a lot more heat and sabot, but it will still stop some of the weaker shots from easily getting through, which is still good by medium tank standards. So this tank takes away the only problem the T-44 had, which was the lackluster performance of the cannon, but adds the problem of the reload, which means you might have more success playing this thing a little less aggressively. The armour will still definitely let this thing brawl and survive a while on the front lines, but if you get caught out missing a shot or make a mistake in your positioning, it's much more likely you'll get punished for it. At a rough average, your gun reloads around 4 seconds slower than every other contemporary tank around this BR. That's not always going to be the case of course, but on average it is close to this number, so you will need to hold back a little bit and place your shots carefully. Thankfully, once you unlock some of the better rounds, the gun does become very consistent, and you'll be able to get through most enemies easily. But it is still a good idea to be a little bit careful, especially at very close range, as most enemies will outpace your reload. The tank overall is great though, and it's fair to say that you can situationally rely on all aspects of the vehicle: the mobility, the firepower, and the armour. But out of all of these assets, armour is easily the least reliable, so playing to the strengths of your mobility and cannon is what's going to keep you alive the longest. Because of the reload, I wouldn't recommend playing at extremely close range. Try playing around an area of cover so you can retreat while on reload, and Really, as long as you're not hugely vulnerable while reloading, the tank really will just do the rest for you. It can get around the map quickly, bounce shots from some of the weaker guns, and cut through the vast majority of armor you'll come up against. Despite the reload, it's still a very versatile tank that can do anything, really. It works in up tiers, on long-range and urban maps, it can snipe and brawl, it'll do whatever you want it to as long as you're careful. Keep it on flat ground and maintain a bit of distance between your enemies, and the tank will do just fine. Pros: great firepower, decent armor, good mobility, and versatile. And the cons: long reload. Verdict: get it. This vehicle is really great. It has a lot of advantages in every aspect and will work almost everywhere you put it. It's a great backup for the higher tier lineups as well, as the gun and mobility will always let the tank work. It's definitely one to go for. Next up, something a bit heavier, the IS-2, one of Russia's most recognisable heavy tanks. The IS-2 inherits identical mobility and armour from the IS-1, although the area around the breach is slightly better protected, and that's because the IS-2 comes equipped with the 122mm D25 cannon, which is an extremely potent gun and easily one of my favourites. It comes with 2 standard rounds, APHE and capped APHE, and as always, the capped round is really what you should be going for. It has the same amount of filler, and just offers better angled penetration. Because of the caliber and penetration power, it can easily cut through almost every enemy you'll face with ease, and have no trouble overmatching angled armor as well. The filler also means that one-shots are very common, so at 5.7, this cannon is really great. However, you know what's coming. The reload is extremely long at 27.1 seconds stock, which is a huge amount of time to be vulnerable for. This thing can't really play like a conventional heavy tank and have constant success. It needs to be positioned a little bit more carefully as to not allow enemies the ability to rush you. The armor still isn't bad, it can bounce a lot of rounds if the enemy takes a rushed shot, so much like the IS-1 we covered previously, remember to slightly angle and stay on the move if you're about to be shot at. Overall, this thing works best at the mid to long ranges, as at long range the gun will still work really well. At close range you don't really have any additional advantages. When you're close to enemies you're vulnerable from the reload, and the armour is much easier to get through. As always though, I don't want to pigeonhole tanks. You can still very much play at a close range and succeed, but you do need to be a bit more careful, as the assets you have are somewhat weaker here. To counter the reload, I'd aim to play around an area of cover, either a dip in the terrain, some rocks, or around your teammates. As long as you play close to cover that you can hide behind while reloading, the IS-2 will really do the rest. There's very few enemy tanks you'll actually struggle with, so usually a connecting hit anywhere will knock them out. You also have great reactive mobility forwards and in reverse, which easily allows you to pop out of cover, fire an enemy, and retreat back to safety. This is where you'll find the most consistency. But the advantage the IS-2 has on top of this is the situationally effective armour. If you do get caught out and fired at, as long as you keep moving, you might bounce shots from time to time. It is a heavy tank after all. So, even though its playstyle works better when using the tank a little bit more passively, if you're forced into a more aggressive brawling situation, you can still come out on top. The IS-2 as well inherits a bit of KV-2 syndrome in that enemies will be scared to push you even if they know you've recently fired. Their irrational fear of being shot by this huge cannon will kick in and override the rational part of their brain that's telling them they do have more time to rush you, so you can use this to your advantage as well. If you're reloading but show aggression, such as driving forwards like you could fire at an enemy, they'll probably be put off rushing you in the same way. These big guns really instill fear in the players you fight, so you can sometimes use that fear as a weapon in itself, as needlessly dramatic as that sounds. I can appreciate it might come across as pretentious, but the mind games you can play with vehicles like this can really have an impact on their performance. Generally though, just try and stick with some cover and don't get too close, and the IS-2 will work well. Pros: great firepower, decent mobility, decent armour, and versatile. And the cons: very long reload. Verdict: get it. The cannon is really satisfying to use and effective, and the tank works well in up tiers too, as the gun can still deal with the vast majority of tanks you'll see at 6.7. The armour won't be quite as reliable in those matches, but the gun still will be, so it's a good versatile option to have in your lineup in any case. Next up is the IS-2 Mod 1944, which keeps the firepower and mobility identical, but offers some significant buffs to the armour without increasing the weight. The front plate has been significantly buffed at 140mm sloped, which makes it almost invulnerable from the vast majority of enemy rounds you'll be seeing. The sloping side armour next to the front plate has as well been increased. The turret also has a bit of a buff, with an overlapping 100mm plate over the mantlet, bringing the thickness up to 200mm in certain spots, which is pretty good. And on top of all this, with the unlockable armor upgrade, mesh screens are added to the sides of the turret to disrupt chemical rounds, and a couple of additional track armor slats have been added to the lower plate, which is very much necessary as this version does suffer from a few weak spots. The mod 44 is only at 6.3 because of the buffs to the armor, and the general buffs it gets are pretty great. The hull and turret are reinforced, which does add a lot to its general survivability, but the lower plate, cupola and turret ring are all very easy to get through, especially the last two weak spots, as there's no way to hide them while in combat. An APHE round into the cupola will generally cripple the tank, and as it's only 90mm thick, every enemy realistically is going to have a constant way of getting a shot into the tank, which isn't great for a vehicle balanced solely on its armor. Of course though, there are always ways to keep yourself alive. Like all of these tanks, keep moving slightly if you're being scoped in. On the move, an accurate shot into the cupola is hardly an easy shot to land, same with the turret ring as well. Like the IS-1 and 2, I'd angle slightly, not much at all, but just a little bit, just so the lower plate has a very slight angle to it. And if possible, try and present the enemy the left side of the turret to shoot from your perspective. It's an annoying thing to remember in the heat of combat, but the left side has the double stacking armor protection and the right side doesn't. So if you can, just try and angle your turret slightly in favour of the left side. Because the barrel effectively blocks off the other side of the turret, this forces the enemy to shoot the left side, which has a much higher chance to bounce shots. Despite the additional armor, not much really changes around the playstyle itself. The armor of course is much better overall, but because of the constant weak spots it has, it can't at all be reliable. I'd still recommend playing at a distance if possible, as this will make the weak spots much harder to hit. Overall, the 44 is just a scaled up version of the IS-2 better equipped to fight higher tier tanks. Its offensive performance is unchanged, and just really offers some passive buffs to the survivability. So, if you play it in a similar way to the previous IS-2, it will still do well. One last thing to tack on to the end here though, which goes for both of the IS-2s, if you're shooting at an enemy with very weak protection, try and aim for the thickest part of effective armor the enemy has, as if your round passes through less than 19mm of effective armor, the fuse won't go off, so you may just overpen and do very little damage. So keep this in mind too when you're engaging some of the weaker enemies. Anyway, pros: great firepower, decent mobility, good armor, and versatile. And the cons: very long reload, and constant weak spots. Verdict: get it. Russia has a very strong 6.3 lineup, and this tank fits in quite nicely with it. Its armor won't always be reliable, but it will still save you sometimes. And the gun, for the most part, will always work too, so it's a decent option to have access to. Next up, onto some lighter vehicles, and we're starting with the PT-76B, a notoriously unforgiving vehicle, but one with a fair few advantages unique to it at this BR. It's the lowest actual tank in terms of battle rating to be equipped with a full stabilizer, so the gun is always perfectly steady on the move, meaning you can quite easily get accurate shots onto enemies before they can fire at you. It's also the lowest in terms of BR, though not by much, to have access to a heat FS round. It's not incredibly different to regular heat rounds though, but it does have on average a higher velocity, so it's fairly easy to aim. That's really where its advantages stop though. It has no armor, around 15mm average, and it's not that quick for a light tank either. It's barely faster than the T-34s, and with a fairly ineffective reverse gear as well. And on top of this, it has a number of drawbacks placed upon it in regards to its firepower. Its reload is comparatively very long at 11.1 seconds stock, longer than all of the reloads of contemporary cannons of a similar caliber. It also comes with a stock APCR round, which is pretty terrible. This is basically a bit of a legacy soft balancing factor. When the PT came out a few years ago, it was one of the only post-war vehicles that fought with World War II tanks, and as you can imagine, in the climate back then, a lot of people were very upset that a tank this low had access to heat FS that could negate pretty much all armor. Oh, how times have changed. So, to somewhat lessen the effect of the heat, they gave it the stock APCR round to passively limit the number of players using the heat. The APCR shot itself isn't entirely useless, but it's fairly ineffective when compared to the heat. The PT does also get an APHE round as well, although it's not immensely powerful. Its penetration performance is very similar to the T-34's APHE round, although this version has less filler and isn't capped, so it will bounce on some of the harsher angles. At tier 2 though, you finally get the heat round, which, to be honest, isn't really groundbreaking. It's certainly good at 200mm off penetration, but it doesn't do a huge amount of damage, especially against the World War II vehicles it fights against. As they mostly have quite spread out crew, from the front it's very hard to one-shot a Panther, Tiger or Sherman. You'll be able to take out a few crew members, but then you'll have around a 10-second wait to fire again, which is really a fairly long time in the heat of combat. To make this thing a bit more forgiving, I'd say it's worth ditching the APCR round and give it the APHE stock, or at least put the heat at tier 1. On top of that, the reload could probably be brought down by a second or so as well. All the sources that I found on the PT give it around a 6 to 8 shot per minute average, so shaving off a second or so would keep it relatively on par with the 90, 88 and 85mm guns, which would really help it out. It doesn't need all these drawbacks anymore because its advantages aren't as special. The stabilizer certainly is, but the heat round isn't really worth the grind or the reload. It just doesn't do enough damage consistently to justify an 11-second stock reload. I might be fighting a bit too heavily here for a second to be cut off the reload, but this is a very inaccessible vehicle, especially to newer players, so it really needs all the help it can get. For actually playing the vehicle though, there's not a lot that it can do consistently. This thing is easily more of a support tank. It suffers on the flanks due to the slow reload and average speed, so it can't consistently work there. It's also quite large for a light tank, so keeping it out of sight is a good way to play. If you want to be a bit more aggressive and use the stabilizer, a good tactic is to rush one of the flanking roads from the start. You'll likely catch out some light vehicles like Hellcats this way, and because you have a stabilizer and heat, you can hull break these vehicles effortlessly. Just be careful where you go next, as you'll easily get overwhelmed by medium and heavy tanks, so after this aggressive push, it's a good idea to stick to cover and remain quite passive. You just don't have the reliable killing power or the reload to fight off a lot of tanks at once. This thing really is an assist machine. You'll likely get a crit on any tank you hit, but you'll quite rarely one-shot. Because of this, sticking with your team is a pretty good idea, as you can easily disable and scout enemies but not finish them off quickly on your own. It's quite hard to consistently secure kills with this thing, so the PT is a great option if you want to get some cheap aircraft spawns with the scouts. It's also important that you try and remain undetected for as long as possible. If you're behind a corner, for example, and an enemy is aware that you're there, there's nothing you can do. You can't bait a shot with your armor as it's so weak, and as your turret is quite far back on the hull, you can't peek or scrape either, so you really want to avoid the situation. An ideal safe spot for this tank is one that has a lot of cover, and one that will let you pop in and out to fire off shots. This is something the PT does really well down to the stabilizer, as you can poke out, fire and pull back all in one motion. You don't need to wait for the gun to level off. This is arguably the biggest advantage you have, so a spot that lets you take advantage of this is really where you want to be. Another advantage of staying around cover in general is protection from planes, as if any fighter with guns spots you, they will strafe you out in a few passes, so sticking close to vertical cover is a really good idea. It's also important to aim your shots very carefully with this tank. The heat will most likely get through everything you hit, but it won't do a lot of damage behind that, so you really want to disable enemies with the first shot and ideally knock them out with the second. So either a shot into the breach or engine would be a good idea. From the front, with Panthers and Tigers, you can disable the driver and the gunner in a single shot as they sit in a line, so if you see one of these tanks, shoot through the right side of the hull. I could sit here for hours and give you what I think is the best shot to take on every vehicle, but these videos are already long enough already, so basically, if possible, go for the driver and the gunner in a single shot, and if in doubt, go for the breach. It's always best to prioritise shooting out the breach or the crew. The heat will generally one-shot a tank if it hits ammo, but as the cone of damage behind the shot is quite weak, you risk missing and doing very little damage. So, unless you're extremely confident with the ammo rack locations, it's best to play it safe. Pros: decent mobility, good firepower, and stabilizer. And the cons: terrible survivability, long reload, and low versatility. Verdicts: get it. Now, it's not always going to be very fun or useful, but it's a good backup for the higher tiers and is actually a fairly good teaching tool. A lot of vehicles in this tree down the line actually have quite similar playstyles to this thing, so getting practice for it early will really set you up well for some of the later IFVs. The PT works basically the same wherever you play it in terms of BR. It's actually arguably a bit more reliable in the higher tiers down to the crew placement of enemy tanks, but anyway, it's a useful vehicle to have and learn, but just don't expect for it to perform quite as consistently as most of the other vehicles this tier. Next up, we have the ASU-85, a very light tank destroyer, which, like the ASU-57, was also designed around airborne operations. This ASU comes with a very good cannon, a long 85mm, which actually beats the 100mm in terms of penetration performance on the APHE round. It does have slightly less filler, but commonly one-shots all the same. It also gets access to an unlockable heat round that can get through 300mm of armor as well, which is great for some of the tougher tanks. And as well as this, it also gets a rangefinder and the scouting ability too. Everything else though is pretty terrible. The mobility overall is very poor, it's slow to accelerate and struggles to get around the map quickly. And the armour as well is pretty bad too, 45mm sloped at the front, which offers around 100mm of effective protection, which at 6.3 isn't really enough anymore. On top of this, the side armour is only 6mm thick, meaning that artillery fragments can easily punch through this thing. However, it can't hull break, so that's something, I guess. Now, it's pretty safe to say the ASU overall is one of the hardest vehicles to play well consistently, as it has no turret, no armour, and underwhelming mobility. All it has is the gun, which means in playing it, you can't ever make a mistake with your positioning, otherwise you're out. The armour won't save you and the mobility won't save you, all you have is the firepower, which isn't really enough of an asset on its own as the vehicle lacks the armour and mobility to safely get the gun into a spot where it can work. Nothing about this vehicle can be constantly reliable. If you do penetrate an enemy, they'll likely go up in one shot, but you'll need to play very carefully to make that happen while also maximising your survival time. This thing is only really in its element at long range. The rounds are quite easy to aim and the unlockable rangefinder helps even further. As there's no reliable way to actively buff your armour, the best thing you can do is make yourself a smaller target, so the further away the better. Your reload is also a couple of seconds longer than average at 11.2 seconds stock, so playing it at range helps regarding this too, as if you're playing beyond say 12-1500 meters, it's unlikely that an enemy will be able to land an accurate shot on you first try, so even if you miss a shot and alert the enemy to where you are, it's not very likely they'll hit you right back, allowing you to fire again. Ultimately, the problem with this vehicle is that there's no way to nullify its drawbacks. The best you can do is try and lessen their effects slightly, and across the board, you can do this by playing it at range. If the map doesn't allow for a long-range sightline, there's not really any reason to play this vehicle. It's just so vulnerable at close range that you might as well be playing any other tank available at 6.3. You can of course find sporadic success in close range engagements, but more often than not, it's not going to work out. Pros: great firepower and rangefinder. And the cons: poor mobility, poor survivability, and low versatility. Verdict: it'll have to be avoid it. Now, usually I'd say consider it for the gimmick, but in total there are 3 6.3 tank destroyers Russia gets at this tier, and the other 2 are more consistent and slightly more versatile. The ASU has the technology to work very well in a specific location, which isn't really enough to justify using it and spading it over other vehicles that do the same job way more reliably at the same BR. It can potentially work great, but really for the average player it's not worth suffering the tedium when it doesn't. Next up, we have the Su-100P, an open-top tank destroyer equipped with the 100mm gun. Its performance is exactly the same as the 100 we covered on the T-44 earlier, so to have that at 6.3 is pretty great. Also, as this thing has 2 loaders, its reload is a lot quicker overall as well, at 9.8 seconds stock, which is almost on par with the average reload at this BR. It also effectively has a turret as well and can traverse the gun 77 degrees either side, which is a pretty good advantage for a tank like this. It's also very mobile and actually has one of the fastest hull traverses I've ever seen. It can really turn around quickly, which it will need to do as the gun traverse itself is very slow, which makes reacting to enemies on the fly quite difficult. If you meet an enemy on the move, it's going to be very hard to get the gun on target before they fire at you, which they can do really without aiming, as this thing has no meaningful protection anywhere. Frontally, it's only 20 to 25mm thick, so wherever an enemy hits you, it is going to go through and likely do a lot of damage. However, despite having the function, it rarely hull breaks. When playing the vehicle again for this video, I was never actually hull broken once from standard kinetic rounds, so it does have a bit of artificial survivability there, although that's not to say it has any reliable protection. Due to the mobility, this thing is quite versatile for a tank destroyer, but still works best sniping at range or out of sight on the flanks. You can still pick up kills with it on the front lines, but as its reaction time is quite slow, you likely won't last long. Playing it at range will keep you alive much longer. The slow traverse of the gun isn't so much of an issue at range either, as you can effectively cover more distance while moving the gun less. And if you're spotted, you can easily use the mobility to dip back out of sight. I would always try and keep the gun pointed forwards as well. If you swing it round to the left or right to track an enemy, it'll take a long time to traverse back to the centre or the other side of the hull, which could catch you out if an enemy appears from a different angle. It's always better for you to angle the hull towards the enemy and then train the gun on them. This means you don't need to move the gun very far to hit a target, which is vital for saving a few seconds. This is one of those vehicles that mainly works best in tandem with a bit of map knowledge. If you can get this thing into a good spot where it can cover a large sightline at range, it will do very, very well. but as it's quick and turreted somewhat, it can adjust to how the match is going, and react a lot better than most TDs. It can reposition aggressively or defensively pretty quickly, which is something that most vehicles like this can't do. If at all possible, I would still stick to the far ranges though, as this will keep you alive much longer. You can't risk rolling around out of cover, as if you meet an enemy on the move, you likely won't be able to react quick enough to take them out. Basically, always try and have some cover around you or an escape route nearby, and you will pick up some kills. Pros: great firepower, good mobility, and versatile. Cons: poor survivability, and slow gun traverse. Verdict: get it. There's one more tank destroyer at 6.3 to see later on, which could potentially be more your style, but overall this one does have the most potential. Granted, it's very weak, but it also has the mobility to get the gun into positions where it will really work effectively, which is a really good advantage. It works well in up tiers and can make for a pretty good backup in the higher tier lineups as well. It's of course not very forgiving, but if you play it safe around cover, it will get the job done. Next up, we have some more armoured tank destroyers, and we're starting with the ISU-152. This vehicle couples the firing platform from the SU-152 in the previous tier with the chassis of the IS series. It's at the same BR as the previous 152, as this version sacrifices a little bit of speed for a little bit of armour, a trade-off that doesn't drastically improve its performance. Firepower is identical, it uses the same cannon with the same reload and traverse speeds. It does get a new heat round though that can get through 250mm of armour, but it doesn't really have much of a meaningful use. The high explosive round and the capped APHE round will still perform way more consistently. When ground forces came out, this thing was 6.7, and the heat round was pretty good at getting through tougher vehicles like the King Tigers. Now at 5.0 it's unable to see those vehicles, so it's not realistically going to see anything it'll need the heat for. It still does great damage, but it won't one-shot quite as consistently. And for comparison, the APHE round can still get through the front plate of an angled Panther at over 1000 meters, so realistically the heat is a bit redundant here. This thing is slower forwards and in reverse compared to the previous 152, but that doesn't really ever come into play. Because of the 20-second plus reload, they can't really use the mobility to push into the map, as they'll get overwhelmed very quickly. So this isn't a drawback that really hurts its ability overall. The worst mobility though, of course, is a trade-off for the armour, which can actually be used quite effectively. Frontally, it's 90mm sloped slightly backwards, giving it around 100mm of effective armour. The upper sides are 75mm and the lower sides are 90mm. When this thing is entirely front on, you're hardly going to bounce much apart from maybe the jumbo, but you can somewhat angle this thing if you're careful. If you know you're about to take a shot, angle your right side towards the enemy and put it into reverse, as this pulls the enemy into a trap with how your armour looks. The side armour here is at a slight angle, so it appears roughly to normalise, which would, in theory, present the best shot, but as this plate is still 75mm thick, it still carries a lot of effective armour. The American 75 and the standard German 88 can't really get through unless you're at very close range, even the Panther's gun struggles as well. And additionally, even if you are penetrated here, generally the commander and loader will soak up all the fragments. Even if they don't, the breach will still soak up the rest of the fragments, protecting the other 3 crew members on the other side, allowing you to effectively tank a shot. Regardless of what it is you're fighting, this is going to always be the place you want to be hit if you know an enemy's going to fire at you. So, if you see an enemy lining up a shot, start reversing and angle slightly. A lot of the common guns around 5.0 really will struggle. As far as playstyle itself goes, it's a lot like most other high caliber long reload tanks. Hang back with the team and play the defensive support vehicle. To keep your armour effective, you're going to want to avoid close range engagements, so try and at least stay past 500 meters at all times. Your armour isn't reliable completely flat front on or at close range. At distances, incoming rounds will of course have weaker penetration, but the distance will also give you more time to effectively angle, which is really vital for keeping this thing alive. Really just stick around some cover and with your team, and try not to advance too far into the map on your own. You're very vulnerable from the sides as you lack the mobility to adapt to enemies coming from new positions. So basically just try and play it a bit more passively. And like the previous 152, go for the capped APHE round as your main shell. Pros: overwhelming firepower and decent armour. And the cons: long reload and low versatility. Verdict: I'd get this one. It's not amazingly functional like the previous vehicle, but it will largely always work and be a relatively fun support tank. Like I said in the last video, either this version or the previous will work fine in the same job. I personally prefer this version down to the armour and the machine gun, but if you generally prefer mobility in vehicles, the regular SU might be more your thing. In any case, this tank offers a good alternate playstyle for the same role. Next up is the ISU-122, which is a vehicle that's actually very easy to explain. This thing shares identical mobility and armour to the previous ISU, and also uses a functionally identical cannon to the IS-2. So it couples assets we've covered extensively already, so I won't dwell too much on this one. Essentially, when compared to the 152, this thing offers a slightly slower reload, more penetration, but less post-pen damage. But really, the 122 will 9 times out of 10 one-shot anyway, so it's not like you're missing out on any potential kills using this thing over the 152. At 5.3, the armour can still work if you angle in the same way, but as you're more likely to see up tiers, it might not be quite as reliable. You can still certainly get a lot of bounces, and generally, I would play this thing in exactly the same way as you'd play the previous ISU. There's not really any other unique assets, so I can't really add anything else to this one. Pros: great firepower, and cons: long reload, and low versatility. Verdict: consider it. Having a 122mm cannon in a 5.3 lineup is a pretty useful thing to have, as it would be the only thing you have that can reliably deal with enemies you'll see in up tiers. But it can be a bit tedious to play, especially considering that the fantastic Su-85M is 5.3 as well. I'd say this thing has more longevity in a lineup when compared to the 85M, as its gun will be effective well beyond the tier, but it just isn't as versatile and will struggle to find effective positions on a lot of maps. So it's hard for me to definitively say which one would be better, as really it's all down to preference. If you want something for your 5.3 lineup with a decent gun and can deal with up tiers, go for this thing. But if you prefer the versatility and protection that comes with the 85M, maybe skip this one, as it does get outclassed immediately at the next BR as well. And speaking of, next up is the ISU-122S at 5.7, and a couple of things change here. The breech is slightly redesigned, giving it a little bit more protection, and because of the redesign of the breech internally, the reload is a lot shorter at 19.7 seconds stock. Still really slow by average standards, but a noticeable upgrade. On an ace crew, you can get this thing down to 15.1 seconds, which really isn't bad at all for a 122. Not much else with the vehicle changes, mobility is the same, all other aspects of the armour are the same. It does lose a crew member on the left side if you're facing the tank though, which does mean that the shrapnel sink of getting shot in that side is a little bit less reliable, but for the most part the tactic still works. Despite the reload buff, again, I'd just play it in exactly the same way. As the armour and mobility are effectively the same, you can't play it any more aggressively, especially as you can now start to see 6.7 matches. The gun will still work at those BRs though, and as it's only one of 3 5.7 tanks in the research tree, it can round off the lineup quite nicely. Although all it comes down to playstyle wise is a less versatile IS-2 with a faster reload, so it does add something to the potential playstyles you have, but not a huge amount. Pros: great firepower. And the cons: low versatility. Verdict: again, consider it. I personally really do like this tank. The 122 might be my favourite cannon in the game, but this tank just isn't always workable with the maps you get, and as that aspect is largely out of your control, you'll commonly be getting maps where there's basically no reason to play this thing over the IS-2. The PT-76, although hard to use in its own right and very situational, does add more to the lineup than this thing in terms of playstyle. If you want to sit at long range and fire off high damage rounds comparatively quickly, this thing can honestly be fun, but if you want to have a bit more of an active involvement in the match, using something like the PT over this thing might be the better choice. Next up, finally, our last tank destroyer, the SU-100, which couples the hull of the Su-85M with the standard 100mm cannon we've seen already. When compared to the Su-100P, I'd say this version is slightly more forgiving, but overall has less potential. The armour at 6.3 and above isn't hugely reliable anymore, but if you angle you can still throw off some shots, and of course you're immune from autocannons from the front, which the 100P very much isn't. This version also isn't quite as mobile in any respect, but overall the mobility isn't bad. It can still roll around the map fairly quickly. It's just by comparison, the 100P is much faster. The reload is slower as well, at 13.7 seconds compared to the 100P's 9.8 seconds. So really, all this version has over the P is the survivability, which isn't really reliable anyway. Granted, it's a lot less vulnerable from aircraft and artillery, and if you angle, you can bounce 88s, 90s, etc. if you're lucky, so it does have some passive advantages, but it just doesn't offer any active advantages over the 100P. The advantages the SU-100 has only come into play if you make a mistake, i.e. get shot at. If you were to play the 100P perfectly, you'd get a much better result than if you were using this thing, just because it can move around faster and fire faster. For using this vehicle specifically, I'd just stick to range and avoid very close engagements. Because of the armour, you can somewhat play on the front lines if you can angle in time, but overall for consistency, sticking to the far ranges is much better. It does have the mobility to drive around the map quickly enough though, so it has a bit more versatility in the late game as it's again immune from clean wing fighters, but overall it's quite niche in what it actually does well, and there just isn't really a lot you can do to push its performance to the limits. It just plays like a really standard turretless tank destroyer. All you can really do is not get too close to your enemies and land your shots as accurately as you can, and that's really all you can do. Pros: great firepower and decent mobility. The cons: comparatively long reload and unreliable armour. Verdict: I'd go with a consider it for this one. It does have the most passive advantages out of the other two 6.3 TDs, so if you're not quite as confident with the maps, this tank probably will let you stay alive longer, but it just doesn't have a huge amount of potential to excel like the 100p can. If you really don't like unarmoured vehicles, this tank still likely will work for you, but its ceiling for potential just isn't really very high. If nothing else though, it'll be a decent backup for 6.3 in any case. Next up, our only anti-air this tier, the ZSU-37, which, following the trend of Russian anti-air in general, is far from effective in its intended role. It comes equipped with the same 37mm cannon as the ZIS-43 in the previous tier, but thankfully this time the firing platform is much more stable so the cannon doesn't lose any accuracy. What justifies its BR increase to 4.7 though is mainly a new belt that it gets. This belt is 2-to-1 high explosive to HVAP, and the HVAP round it uses can get through just over 100mm of flat armour at point blank, which is pretty great, but the problem is that the ZSU is rarely able to get into a position to actually use it. The mobility and armour of this thing are both fairly unimpressive. Generally it'll stick around 30 plus kph off-road, which is about average for a conventional tank, and not really enough to allow it to push quickly into the map to get the side shots it needs. As far as armour goes, the turret is protected by 15mm, the hull front is 35, and the lower plate is 45. Despite this, it can still hull break though, which is perhaps a little bit unfair to it. The turret houses 4 of the 5 crew, and they're all very vulnerable to machine guns and artillery, and will generally get picked off very quickly if you're directly around the combat. If this thing gets into a great position though behind enemy lines, it can actually do a lot of work. The cannon still has effectively no reload, so you can just keep spraying at enemies until the barrel overheats. But most of the time it's just so unlikely to be able to reach this position that choosing to take it out in place for regular tank really isn't worth it. Even taking it out as a backup spawn after you get knocked out isn't that viable either, as you'll likely be unable to push far into the map mid-game as enemies will be all over the place, and you'll likely run into someone head on, and from the front this thing will struggle to knock out a lot of 4.7 and above vehicles. As an anti-air specifically, it still isn't really better than the BTR at 3.0 in tier 2. It's hard to get the lead effectively and still fires quite slowly. You can quite easily take out slow aircraft and planes flying directly at you, but being effective only in situational engagements like this doesn't make it a good anti-air. Far from it really. The problem with this vehicle is that it doesn't have any constant advantages. It struggles to hit manoeuvring aircraft as the volume of fire is so low, and it struggles to engage most enemy tanks frontally. This thing's effectiveness basically comes from enemies making mistakes, which you can't of course guarantee they'll make. If you play very cautiously and flank with it, you can potentially have some really good games, but it requires a lot of luck in picking the right routes, and you can't completely guarantee you'll be able to catch enemies out. If you really want to take it out as a tank hunter though, you really just need to be careful. If you're on a map with lots of constant cover and routes into the map itself, you can sneak your way through behind enemy lines if you're lucky. If the map doesn't really allow for this though, I'd really just hawk a cap point, sit behind a corner and wait for enemies to come to you. Realistically, you can take out any tank you come across from the side, so if you sit perpendicular to an opening, you will be able to catch a few enemies off guard. In the higher tiers, it can also pay off to watch the flanks as well, as you'll still be able to cut through pretty much every light vehicle that will try and play this way. As far as what belt to use, I'd main the full armor piercing belt, but carry a few belts of the HVAP. As only every third shot is HVAP, you'll lose a few seconds or so when engaging an enemy with it, as most of your rounds will do no damage. So if you're using it and engaging enemies from the side, they might be able to turn and face you. For versatility, I'd use the solid armor piercing belt from the offset, and if you do see a heavily armored enemy, you can quite easily switch to the HVAP. If you are engaging an enemy from the side, try going for their engine first to disable them, and then strafe through the hull to take out the crew, as this makes sure they can't turn and face you. Apart from that, the only other thing you'll need is a lot of luck. Pros: decent anti-tank ability, and the cons: poor survivability and low versatility. Verdict? Consider it. It's by no means unusable, but it just isn't necessarily much better than the other options you have. The BTR is still much easier in anti-air to use, but as it can't reliably knock out tanks, the ZSU here might be a better option. It can easily cut through light vehicles with the AP rounds, so if you want a little bit more versatility against ground vehicles and you're confident with your aim, this one might just work out for you. Next up, we have our premium line vehicles, and we're starting off with a vehicle that actually isn't a premium, the Type 62, an old event vehicle. This is a Chinese light tank that's basically a scaled down Type 59, or T-54 for an analogue in the Russian tree. It's very fast, and comes with an 85mm gun which can use the same ammo types as the T-44, while also getting a heat round which can get through 300mm of armour. It's a great little tank, but sadly unobtainable at the moment, although if you really do want to play it for yourself, a totally identical version is present in the research tree for China. Next up is the T-34-85E, an old removed pack vehicle, which isn't really that unique. Basically, the E is a T-34-85, but with mesh bed frames bolted to the sides of the hull and the roof. These only really offer 1mm of effective protection, so they have no impact against most rounds and only really protect against artillery. So you're not really missing much. This used to be a pack vehicle back in the day, but has since been removed. It's one of those tanks that generally pops up around the holiday sales and the collection packs, so it's very unlikely this tank will be gone forever. It isn't really worth a fortune though, so don't break the bank over it if it does come around again. Next up, our first actual premium, the KV-122, which is essentially a KV-85 but with a 122mm gun instead. And really, I don't know why this thing is at 5.7. It makes sense on the surface as it's a turreted tank using the 122, which is always really powerful, but it's entirely irrelevant as a vehicle in terms of playstyle here. Chiefly for the reason that it's objectively outclassed by the IS-2 at the same BR, and considering that this is a product, it's a little redundant here. Basically, the KV-122 is to the IS-2 what the KV-85 is to the IS-1, a vehicle with identical firepower, but worse mobility and armour at a lower BR. Maybe having the 122 in a turret is enough on its own to keep this thing at 5.7, but the armour is just so poor for a heavy tank at 5.7, and on top of that it's a pretty slow tank as well. Just to give this thing a meaningful place in the game, I'd really consider lowering it to 5.3, because really there's just no reason to spend just shy of 5,000 golden eagles on this thing when you could just put a talisman on the better IS-2 for around a third of the price. If this thing was dropped to 5.3, it could avoid 6.7 matches potentially, which would really give this thing an effective place in the game. And if it did, I might even actually recommend it. For now though, it's generally better off avoiding. Next up is the IS-2 Revenge, which is an IS-2 Mod 44 with no roof-mounted machine gun and slightly worse lower plate track armour. In all other aspects, it's identical. Ultimately, it's a superficially worse version of the Tech Tree tank, which for 7,480 golden eagles doesn't really give much of an incentive for buying it. It adds nothing to the lineup or playstyle, and apart from the Silver Lion gain, you might as well just talisman the Mod 44 if you like the IS-2 playstyle. This thing is a good vehicle to have as a premium in the game as it does unlock a unique playstyle behind a paywall, but it's just not worth the money really. You can get a better version in the tech tree for free. So I wouldn't go for this one unless there's a sale or you get a personal discount. Next up is the SU-122P, a familiar looking vehicle which is basically the SU-100, but with a 122mm gun instead of the 100 at a lower BR. Like the ISU-122S, this version has the improved breach system as well, so the reload is slightly shorter than normal at 21.7 seconds stock. It also has access to the post-war D shell, which gives it around 25mm of extra flat penetration, while sacrificing 50 grams of filler. This round for 6.0 is undeniably quite good, but again, there's just not really a huge incentive to get this vehicle. There's no lineup at 6.0, and at 6.3 where the lineup is, are 3 other free tank destroyers to choose from that all arguably offer better playstyles. Well, maybe apart from the ASU, but still, a talisman on those vehicles is much more cost effective than paying for this thing. It also has only -2 degrees of gun depression, making it one of the worst vehicles regarding gun depression in the game. For 6,090 golden eagles, it's not really worth it unless you get a big discount really. Your money, sadly, can still be better spent. Next up, something a bit more unique, the T-44-122, which of course comes with the 122 in place of the 85. Its armour is much less effective though, as the front plate is at a weaker angle and has a flat driver's port which is only 75mm thick. The turret as well is also a lot flatter and has an exposed turret ring as well. The armour is still effective, you can still bounce shots, but it's nowhere near as reliable when compared to the regular T-44. The reload is also much longer than normal as well, at 30.2 seconds stock, which is a huge amount of time to wait between shots. This thing used to be really effective back in the day when sloped armor worked a bit differently, but it's not quite as effective now. The loss of reliable armor and reload speed isn't really enough to justify the killing power of the 122 in my opinion. The regular T-44 offers way more in terms of reliability. This thing does form a middle ground between the IS-2 and T-44 though. It's not as well armoured, but it's mobile and has a great cannon. So it effectively takes the best assets both these tanks have and makes them slightly worse at the expense of combining them into one vehicle, which does make it a bit more versatile comparatively, but it does mean that it has less potential than both of them in their respective roles. It can't play like the T-44 because of the worse armour and long reload, so all it really comes down to is a more mobile IS-2 that can't really use the mobility to good effect. You can still have some great games and pick up a lot of kills with it, but you do need to play it fairly conservatively. It does work quite well in a squad though, as if you're playing around your immediate team, they can protect you while you're reloading, which is very much necessary. Generally though, this thing isn't a hugely consistent grinder. It's a lot better than what we've seen so far in terms of premiums, but I still would only really recommend getting it on a discount, as for 6,090 Golden Eagles, it's still a hefty price for a vehicle that won't always work. It can still be fun though, so it's not inherently a terrible vehicle to get. Next up is the T-34-100, which is another vehicle that's quite self-explanatory. It's a T-34 with a 100mm instead of an 85. This tank is very commonly referred to as a glass cannon, which is fairly accurate for it really. It doesn't really have much in terms of meaningful armour. The turret does have some harsh sloping angles around the sides, as it is 90mm thick, so it can bounce some incoming shots, but overall for 6.7 it's nothing to really rely on. This thing can potentially work great, as it's a fast tank with a great gun, but it's in a hard place really. This thing was introduced before the SU-100P and the T-44-100, and these two arguably have a better place in the game. Russia doesn't really have a 6.7 lineup, and it's fair to say the T-44 at 7.0 is really better in every way. It's faster, has more armour, and a slightly faster reload as well, so it doesn't really add much in terms of playstyle to the game anymore. Other vehicles in the tech tree do this thing's job better arguably, so you're not paying for a unique experience. I might be being a bit harsh on this vehicle though, as it does work well beyond its BR and can be a really effective backup for the higher tiers. The gun will always work and the mobility won't hold it back. The armour was never reliable anywhere, so that's not really a detriment to it. It will have a good chance against most enemies until you're commonly meeting tanks with stabilizers, so out of all the premiums this tier, this one does have a lot of longevity, although it's not hugely forgiving. You still need to be a bit passive with it because of the reload. It's hard to completely recommend this one, as it doesn't add anything fresh to the game anymore, and it's not consistently easy to use either. Compared to the previous premiums, it does have a lot more to offer, but that doesn't make it worth buying by default. It's one to consider, especially if you get it on a discount, but we still have one more premium to cover, and a little chat about tier 4 premiums on the whole. So finally today we have the infamous IS-6, a well-armoured heavy tank at 7.3. The hull is immune from basically everything apart from high caliber sabot and heat. APHE and AP will just bounce right off from the front. The turret is only 150mm though around the mantlet, which is quite flat, but it is a fairly small target, so when you're on the move it can still throw off some shots. When this thing came out, it had a magic invisible spall shield behind the mantlet, which made it incredibly survivable to everything really. Those days are long gone though, and at 7.3 it's in a bit of a weird place. It uses a 122 like the IS-2s, but the reload is slightly faster at 20.5 seconds stock. The main problem with the IS-6 is that its performance relies too heavily on what map and BR it gets. At 7.3, this thing can be insanely powerful, bouncing everything that comes its way and one-shotting anything it penetrates. Or it could get 8.3 and fight stabilised tanks with heat and darts, rendering its main advantage practically useless. This thing is on the store for €40 currently, which is still a lot. The problem is that it's just at a battle rating where it either works really well or suffers. Its performance overall relies on chance and factors that you can't can't control, you can't guarantee you won't get a full up tier. Now, it of course can still work well in full up tiers, but it would be dishonest to pretend that it could reliably work in up tiers for most players. And for €40, you're really going to want something with reliability. It's still a great tank though. You can knock out high tier vehicles with the 122 and absolutely demolish teams at 7.3 if you play smart. So it's far from useless, it's just not quite what it was. I wouldn't say it would be a dreadful mistake to buy it. It's versatile and situationally forgiving, which are still great assets. If it was at a BR with slightly less power creep, I'd probably recommend it a bit more. It's a good vehicle for power grinding through the lower tiers effectively though. But something else to consider this tier that goes for all of these premiums actually, is that at tier 4, this thing can only research tiers 5 to 1 effectively, and there's only 9 vehicles in tier 5. In tier 6, there's 16. You can't effectively research these vehicles, and as they're all much higher in terms of RP cost, this thing for the price loses a lot of its effectiveness for grinding. If you'd consider putting €40 into this game, you'd probably stretch that to 50, and for 50, for comparison, you can get a premium in tier 5 that can research all of these vehicles. It's an extra €10 for a lot more potential. Now, I'm in no way saying buy into tier 5 and above premiums, this is just to give some perspective. These expensive tier 4 premiums aren't really effective anymore for their price. High tier in rank 6 and above is really where the development of this game is going, so they've really lost their overall value. When vehicles like this came out, they had much more value because they could effectively research everything, and they just can't anymore, which by comparison makes them a bit redundant really. Their worth doesn't match their price. If you really want to put money in this game solely for the purpose of grinding, tier 4 premiums are probably the least worthwhile. The earlier premiums are generally fun and inexpensive and speed up the early grind, so they have their worth. But as tier 5 for most nations is only made up of a small amount of tanks, the comparative bonus tier 4s get isn't really worth it anymore in my opinion. These tanks can work and be great fun from time to time when judged as vehicles, but as products they just don't offer enough of a boost anymore in the game overall to be worth the money. If you're serious about putting a lot of money into this game to grind to the end game faster, I would really save it for later. Or hey, maybe the IS-6 specifically could be bumped up to tier 5 someday. Next up are the aircraft I'd recommend, and really there's only one plane specifically that I'd recommend going for this tier, and that is the Tu-2S59, which is very similar to the Tu-2 we covered previously, although this version gets a 20mm gunner in the back, which is pretty good. Everything else is pretty much the same though. It gets 4 individual 500kg bomb drops, which is really good. It's offensively the same, so it's not vital you pick this one up, but if the defensive buff sounds good to you, it will still work great. So there we are guys, really hope you enjoyed the video. On screen now are the really only 2 lineups I think you can really make with vehicles from this tier. There's still a couple of vehicles that Russia are missing for tier 4 really, or really like could get for tier 4, like the later IS-2s that could probably make a decent 6.7 lineup. But for now this is really the best you've got. As far as other aircraft goes, really I just go with any fighter that's repair cost isn't too high that has the 23mm or 20mm. As from the roof they can still knock out a fair few tanks, so that's probably what I'd go for if you don't like the Tu-2. But yeah, hope you enjoyed, hope the audio wasn't too bad in general. I am aware that my mic keeps peaking and it sounds really bad in certain spots. I am looking to try and buy a new mic or a new audio system, but for whatever reason, whenever I plug something into or take a USB out of the back of my PC, it blue screens. So I'm just terrified of going near it. I leave it in the corner and just hope it doesn't blow up in the night. So I'm just really trying to ride it out until it just breaks, and then hopefully I can get a whole new setup and it'll be wonderful and magical and you won't need to hear lots of P's all the time. So we'll see. Anyway, I've taken up enough of your time. Hope you have a lovely day, night, evening, and I'm probably going to go to bed because it's getting light outside and I haven't slept yet, so I will disappear. I really hope you enjoy the video, and as always, I will see you next time.